Alright, you guys, so as you will know, it's been nearly 2 weeks since my glorious king, Rafael Nadal, celebrated his 38th birthday. But that being said, this has been a long time coming. Ever since he announced in that press room last May in 2023 that this year, 2024, would probably be his last go of things, a sort of farewell tour. Me being the fanboy shell that I am, I have wanted to make a lot of, celebratory, historic Rafa content, sort of reflect on his best moments, and I don't know, I promise it has not been by design that hasn't happened to this point, but definitely expect more of it to come. But we are kicking it off with the second edition of my season tier list. If you will remember, if you were here last year, I made my initial one on Novak Djokovic's for his birthday last year. Had a lot of fun with it. Obviously, it's a career of damn near 2 decades for all three of these guys in the big three, so no shortage of tough decisions to make, but pretty simple premise here. I'm going to be taking every single year of Rafael Nadal's career dating back to 2005, and rating it on tiers from S being the best all the way down to D being the worst. Obviously, again, I know that Nadal had done things to put him on the radar as someone who was up and coming before '05, but I picked '05 to start simply because it was his first true bite at the apple, play a full season, and as a result get his first true big break and begin to resemble the player he would go on to become then. And so with that, let's take it back to 2005. It's kind of mind-blowing that to this day, the most titles Rafa Nadal ever won in a calendar year came in his aged 19 season back in '05, but that is indeed the case. If you've ever read Rafa's book, you will know that he mentions the way he ended 2004. Huge confidence boost, beating Andy Roddick in a huge pivotal match for Spain in Davis Cup, world number 2 at the time, Roddick. And as we went on, that confidence only grew as the year progressed. Beginning of his season, you had a couple of moral wins in a way, even in losses against number 3 Hewitt in 5 in Australia, and then obviously against the dominant number 1 Federer in Miami, both in which he had a 2-1 and 2-0 lead respectively. What followed obviously kicks off a long-standing tradition, a reign over the dirt. In Europe, immediately got his first Masters title in Monte Carlo, and began what would come to be an 81-match win streak on clay. That streak which was, put to the test several times here. Some of his greatest hits to this day include that cult classic, one of the greatest clay court matches of all time against Guillermo Coria, crazy 5th set comeback from a double breakdown to win in a 5th set tiebreak, north of 5 hours, and then of course beating Roger Federer on his 19th birthday in the semifinals of Roland Garros before locking up his first Grand Slam title 2 days later. Goes without saying, he was a monster on clay out of the box. Still a ways to go elsewhere, but still locked up a Masters title in Canada, and actually his only indoor hardcourt title of his career, rallying from 2 sets down against Ivan Lubicic. 2005 was really a coming out party for Rafa Nadal, cemented him at the top of the game. In spite of not much slam success outside of Roland Garros, when the dust settled, still 4 Masters titles, and this 19-year-old was the only person in the world really in Roger Federer's stratosphere. By all accounts, he blew expectations out of the water, and so I put this one in A tier. The following year, 2006, this season, of course, from the jump, hamstrung a little bit from the foot injury that would come to be a reoccurring struggle in Nadal's career. It was initially diagnosed at the end of 2005, sidelined him for the end of that season as well as the 2006 Australian Open. When he came back, a real outlier result, but still kind of crazy to think about that he rallies from being blitzed by 2006 Federer in one of his favorite conditions and courts in Dubai, ended up taking out the title in the process. And I think right there really cementing the matchup issue thorn in prime Federer's side that Rafa would provide. Another pretty dominant clay court season followed. His clay streak obviously put to the test again in Rome with another all-time great 5-set Masters 1000 final, this time between Federer and Nadal, Rafa having to hold off 2 match points, and then going on to win one of his tougher French Opens. Match against Paul-Henri Mathieu to this day remains the longest match he's ever played at Roland Garros. And Federer, in his best season, as you'd expect, made a valiant stand in the final. But the King of Clay again would weather the storm, securing a second French title. He would of course follow this up, making the Wimbledon final. This time Roger Federer proved too good in the final, and honestly at this point, having missed the Australian Open, you'd have to say pretty successful season. But the rest of the way he would slump. The good results were few and far between, and for that reason, it's a step back from 05 and gets a spot in B tier. Now, 2007, I think you see the beginnings of a prime Rafael Nadal coming down the pipeline. Slump at the end of 2006 kind of continued through the Australian Open. It was broken at Indian Wells. This is one of the more underrated great Nadal tournaments on hard courts ever. Steamrolled through a pretty good draw without the loss of a set. A typical dominant clay court season, albeit 81 match clay court win streak ended at Hamburg. Didn't end up mattering. French Open 2007 is another one that I think is a super underrated Roland Garros run for him. Another, pretty good draw that he ended up steamrolling through to the final. I think in 07 of those 05 to 08 French Open meetings, Federer put in his most resistance in this one, but Nadal still ended up coming through when it mattered most. We go to Wimbledon, and famously a very jam-packed schedule, guys having to play damn near every day. Nadal definitely a part of that circus, having to survive a couple of 5-setters. But in the final, he plays one of his best grass court matches ever. Comes up just short of upending Roger Federer's Wimbledon dynasty. Of course, that would have to wait. After that, he did win another title, but relatively quiet end to the year, especially after Canada. Fitness issues, particularly with the knee, started to flare up. A pattern beginning to develop there of, him wearing down as we get closer to the fourth quarter of the season. But like I said before, I think we got glimpses of prime Nadal emerging in this season, particularly in that span up through Wimbledon, where he was truly excellent. So I put this season still in the bottom rung of A tier. And if 2007 was the precursor, the glimpses of prime Rafael Nadal, 2008 kicked that door down. Make way for our first S tier entry. Not much of a secret there. Obviously, most notably with this season is it marked Nadal finally able to snatch the mantle from Federer as the best player on the planet. Ever since he had emerged as this teen phenom, he had been stuck solidly at number 2 and trying to do his best, improving every year to try and finally supplant Roger from that top spot. And obviously this is where it all came together for him. Goes without saying, one of his most, if not the most dominant Roland Garros and Slam of his career at the French Open in 2008, punctuated with a demolition job unlike we've ever seen against Federer on such a big stage in the final. This actually part of a 32-match win streak that began all the way back in Hamburg and stretched across all 3 surfaces. Along the way, obviously, the sliding doors moment in this scaling of the mountain for him was Wimbledon 2008, only fitting that the decisive moment in his pursuit came in what is regarded widely as the greatest match of all time, and really completed his arc of going at Federer at Wimbledon full circle, getting closer and closer in 06 to 07 to now finally getting over the line in 08. Streak came to an end at the hands of Novak Djokovic in the semis of Cincinnati, but of course soon after he would get him back at the Beijing Olympics. And when all was said and done, at the end of those Olympics when Nadal bit into that gold medal, going back to the Davis Cup quarterfinals prior to clay court season, Nadal had reeled off 49 of his last 51 matches, winning a sparkling 3 Masters titles, the Olympic gold, and 2 Grand Slams in that span against an excellent field in 2008. In other words, no-brainer S tier. And with the year still definitively belonging to him, he picked up right where he left off. We don't really need to talk about anything at the Australian Open other than those last two matches, which still rank among the greatest achievements Nadal has ever pulled off. 5 hours 14 minutes against Verdasco in the semifinals with tennis quality of the highest order in a vacuum, just going off the tennis. A contender, I think, for best tennis match ever played. And then followed up with a match that was just as good for 4 sets against Roger Federer. And somehow again, Nadal was the last man standing in Melbourne, a man for all surfaces, as Dickie Enberg coined. And at that point, having all of his rivals in check and only increasing the gap of who the best player in the game was, it seemed like 2009 was going to be even better for Nadal. In spite of some wonky technique change on his forehand post-Australia, he would still reel off titles in Indian Wells, Monte Carlo, Barcelona, and Rome, as well as making a final in Madrid. And that's where it really fell apart quickly for him. Despite being the overwhelming favorite in Paris again, we all know one of the biggest upsets of all time, Robin Soderling, handing him his first ever Roland Garros loss. And from there, you saw some, physical, mental, personal burnout there. I kind of liken it to Djokovic's 2016, where I think it would have been his year if he just didn't hit the wall. And it's not like his results were terrible the rest of the year, but there definitely was an inflection point where a potential S-tier season got derailed, and so it has to settle for the bottom of A-tier. If there was any consolation for how 2009 got derailed, it didn't take long for the Nadal freight train to get back on track. And while you wouldn't have thought that by the way he started the year, it goes without saying that 2010 belongs in the S tier for Rafael Nadal. It's the only year of his career where he was able to win 3 slams, obviously became the first to win slams on all 3 surfaces in a calendar year. His season didn't really get going until clay season, where he swept the clay season. Monte Carlo, one of his most dominant tournaments ever, obviously cruised through Roland Garros without dropping a set, getting revenge over Robin Soderling. All in all, it is the slam performances that really jump off the paper in this year. I've always viewed it as sort of a Federer 2007 type year, where outside the slams there are plenty of opportunities for it to be an even better year. But his performances in the slams were excellent, particularly at the back end when he needed to be great. Wimbledon obviously survived a couple of early scares, and then absolutely freight trained to the end. And then the US Open, a man on a mission, my personal favorite, looked like an assassin, played like an absolute killer, pretty much as good as it gets for Nadal in a hard court. Obviously the best that he has ever served. You were getting up to 135 mphs off the serve. All in all, it was that US Open run that really encapsulates the monstrous heights that 2010 Nadal scaled. Of course, career slam completed at 24 and recapturing the title of best player in the world. It seemed like he was just getting started on his very own dominant run over the sport. So, obvious S tier here, no surprise there. 2011, you guys know the tale. Looked like, the seas were parting for Nadal to take over from what was viewed as an aging Roger Federer at the time. And in his own words, fantastic season. My one problem was Novak Djokovic. And, you can't really put it any better than that. As far as week in, week out consistency, especially through Wimbledon, this was right there with any Nadal season ever. That being said, you could see the mental block starting to form with every passing loss to Djokovic as the year progressed. And really, it's as simple as that. He was beating everybody else. Before the first time in his career, it was going to be him that was going to need to adjust and not vice versa. This became the one opponent that he was unable to get away with playing his standard regulation tennis. And he learned that the hard way. Obviously, still got his Roland Garros title. 2 more slam finals at Wimbledon and the US Open, as well as 4 additional Masters 1000 finals, all lost at the hands of Novak Djokovic. Courtesy of one of the all-time great seasons from the number 1, he was the second best all year. But still, it's not like he was throwing in these dud performances, I think Wimbledon aside, so I think you have to reward the week-in, week-out consistency and still lock in 2011 Nadal in A tier. 2012, I think Rafael Nadal got the message loud and clear that scaling the mountain again, this time with the bad matchup for him in Novak Djokovic, was going to require a little bit of extra something, whether that was aggression, courage, whatever the case may be. And he started the year in 2012 with, I think, probably the best tournament he's ever played in a losing effort. Everybody knows how the 2012 Australian Open ended for him, with a defeat just shy of 6 hours and another addition to the short list of candidates for greatest match of all time. But being one half of what made that match so epic did seem to breathe new life into Nadal, breathe new belief into him that he could live with a well-playing Djokovic, even at his pet slam, and that spurred him on to have one of his all-time great clay court seasons, absolutely dominant. With the outlier of a loss on blue clay, on red clay, he lost just the one set the entire year. And that came in the final of Roland Garros, where obviously he was able to finally pump the brakes on the Djokovic tear going back to the beginning of 2011. Overall, when it happened and to this day, I still feel this was a year that with his standard of play, even with the shock loss at Wimbledon, he was on his way to an S tier, at the very least A tier year. But we know the rest. After a truly shocking exit at Wimbledon in the second round, Nadal sidelined the rest of the year with a knee injury. Of his one slam seasons, I do think the heights he reached in 2012 are the highest of any of them. But missing the last 5-6 months of the season puts a cap on how high you can put this one, so it goes in B tier. 2013, one of the great comeback seasons of all time. Pretty easily my favorite and most enjoyable season of his career as a stan. Everything was so perfect, from the forehand to the iconic moments all year. Even the aesthetics with the kits and the hair. Needless to say, the vibes were off the charts, and you just had to be there to get what I'm talking about. Thankfully for Rafa, his sky-high level through most of 2012 remained when he picked up again in 2013, even having to miss the beginning of the year in Australia. He would pretty much hit the ground running, and I'm sure you guys know the tale. Another dominant clay court season, this time surviving, a heck of a lot of grindy struggles throughout pretty much every event. Most notably getting a sort of mirror match to the 2012 Australian Open, another entry to the ever-growing catalog of Rafa LAKEY classics. This period was still smack in the middle of the peak of their rivalry. This time it was Nadal rallying from a breakdown in the fifth to pull it out 9-7. But what came as a shock to pretty much everybody is he probably had a more dominant hardcourt season through the US Open, as you had titles in Indian Wells, and then a sweep of the summer hardcourt season, taking out Montreal, Cincinnati, and the US Open. And like I said, beginning of 2012, this was pretty much the culmination, I think, of Nadal's second scaling of the mountain of an all-time great rival. He had already done it with Federer in 2008, and that same arc kind of came full circle again, as taking out Djokovic to win the 2013 US Open. Even in a season where he won a grand total of 0 matches in Australia and Wimbledon, he was a runaway world number one, and deservedly so. If that doesn't say it all, I don't know what will. But with 10 total titles, 5 Masters, 2 Slams, and a return to the mountaintop, this is an easy S-tier season for Rafael Nadal. 2014 started looking like more of the same for Rafa. Aside from a match against Dimitrov in the quarters, pretty much rampaged to the Australian Open final, untroubled. We know the script from here. He's a heavy favorite against a guy who hadn't won a set against him, let alone a match, in Stan Wawrinka. Wawrinka, to his credit, new player at this point, and pressed all the right buttons to seize control early. Setting a breakdown, Nadal's back goes out, and he's never given a fighting chance to work his way back. And then pretty much the rest of the season, Nadal looks vulnerable. Even once we hit clay, this is the worst clay court season of Nadal's career since Nadal became Nadal, which probably makes it that much more sweet that he was able to sort of rectify the year with one of his more underratedly dominant Roland Garroses. Even still, throughout the tournament, he is experiencing the after effects of his back injury, but able to power through. Wimbledon don't actually think he was that bad, but nonetheless an up-and-coming and nothing-to-lose Nick Kyrgios serves him off the court there, and that's pretty much wraps on his year. He's unable to defend his glorious North American hardsword swing from the prior year with a right wrist injury, and really from that point he's not himself again for a while. 2014 in isolation, carried by a really strong start and a very impressive Roland Garros. It's like a worse 2012, so it goes in the bottom of B tier. Nadal did return for limited action in the fall of 2014, and he was really bad, and that was ominous for what was to come in 2015. The numbers might not say it, but since Nadal became Nadal, I think this is pretty easily the worst year of his career. The numbers do not bear out what the eye test did, because it really felt like watching 2015 Nadal that he was struggling to get balls past the service box. As he stated, he was going through a confidence crisis here, and nothing bore that out more than the forehand. What's been, in my opinion, throughout his career, the greatest single ground stroke of all time, looked like an absolute shell of itself, and without his greatest weapon, he was exposed time and time again in the biggest matches when he was able to make it to them. For the most part, he was thrashed in them. And aside from actually a surprisingly good fall post-US Open, there's pretty much no highlights from this season, aside from him being pigeonized by Fabio Fognini throughout the year. D tier, need I say any more? 2016 started out looking like it was even worse than 2015. Just absolutely atrocious through the golden swing. And you've heard it from me before, I have never given up on Rafael Nadal except for the end of this year. That being said, sneakily from Indian Wells through the Olympics, even US Open, 2016 showed signs of life. By the numbers, you could argue this was an even worse year than 2015, but that aforementioned stretch, while not at his best, it certainly teased what was to come. You got an actually pretty good clay court season out of him. His path to the Monte Carlo title was legit impressive, and in this span he competed actually really well with Djokovic in their Indian Wells and especially Rome match, despite being low on confidence sort of letting him down in the crucial moments. Despite that being shot down by a wrist injury forcing him out of Roland Garros, he wasn't that far away from medaling in singles and doubles at the Olympics, but the rock bottom moment for me was the US Open against Luca Pouille. And to be frank, he again played a lot better than his US Open loss the prior year. In a vacuum, this shouldn't have been as crushing a loss as it was to me, but it was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. I legitimately, for the first time, thought he was finished. As a fan, it really felt like a crushing blow because it felt like for every 2 steps forward, we were getting 5 backwards, even when it seemed like progress was coming. So, this is still D tier without a doubt, but signs of life are the takeaway in hindsight. And thank God I was wrong. Never in my wildest dreams could I have expected the 5-6 year run that was to follow after what I felt was rock bottom. To add insult to injury for where Nadal was at the end of 2016 results-wise, pretty much shut down the season after the US Open on account of a bad wrist again. And in my opinion, when we flipped to 2017, it's not like Nadal got drastically better from the jump. The results would say so, certainly, but I wouldn't distinguish that much between his level at the start of the year and that signs of life phase in 2016. His serve was much better, but what I think really spurred him on was just the confidence boost of mentally being able to get through a couple of tough matches in Australia, matches where he was pretty automatic in faltering in 2015 and 16, and ultimately it was the confidence boost, I think, that allowed him to unlock the level we saw once we got to clay court season and beyond that we came to expect of him through his elite post-prime phase. Standout moment obviously being his return to where he belonged, with a tournament that screamed he was hungry for more at 2017 Roland Garros, one of his best ever, just handing out bakery products all over the place, and La Decima punctuated one of his greatest clay court seasons. And with 2017 being the last year Nadal's body held up to play a full tennis calendar, he was just rock solid consistent the rest of the way. He was a lock to be at the business end of pretty much every tournament he entered. Second half of 2017, the field kind of became decimated with injury, and he was there to pick up the pieces and romp through the back end of the US Open. Ultimately, his year-round consistency earned him a fourth year-end #1 finish. And all in all, 2017 to me is the most impressive comeback year of Rafael Nadal's career. Every single other great year off an injury layoff, he was playing well enough before that I felt like he still had the baseline level of play in him to make his way back. That was not the case with the 2 years coming into 2017. Really just unimaginable to me that he went from his game being in shambles to back on top. So that makes for a very solid entry into the A tier for 2017. 2018 level-wise is the best year, I think, of Rafael Nadal's post-prime. Ultimately, it's sort of bittersweet with how thin the margins were for this year to be a real special one for him. The year began and ended with some misfortune, whether that was bad scheduling at the end of 2017 to set him up going into 2018, and then bookended with just a physical gauntlet in New York to end his season. But in between, there was a lot of glorious tennis there. Super dominant clay court season again, a French Open title that felt like a formality from beginning to end, and then a Wimbledon run that seemed like it was set up for him to lift the title again there. 10 years after his career-defining win at Wimbledon '08, he finished an absolute epic quarterfinal with Juan Martín del Potro, with the match time reading the exact same as that '08 match, 4 hours 48 minutes, and then with 3 looks at breakpoint in the semifinal against Djokovic to win potentially 9-7 in the 5th again. It just seemed like destiny. Unfortunately, it was not to be. The 2018 Wimbledon semi actually turned out to be the tale of Novak Djokovic's revival, and honestly, I'm perfectly okay with that. Of the biggest losses of Nadal's career I've experienced, this is the one, from the moment it happened, I've been the most at peace with. The tennis was so glorious. In my opinion, it's the best match I've ever watched live. Not really much room for disappointment. One of those matches you can take pride in putting the best foot forward and it just not being meant to be. But for good measure, Nadal still gave us another one of the best matches of the year and of all time with the late night thriller at the US Open with Team. Ultimately, 2018, he's injured for big pockets of it, but when he plays, he's pretty automatic to play some incredible tennis. It's an A tier that missed S by truly the slimmest of margins. Into 2019, we continue with the trend of Nadal's body unable to hold for a full tennis calendar anymore. Really starts picking and choosing his spots. Having not played since the US Open in September, making the Australian Open final was a great result for him, even if it ended in the most lopsided loss of his career in a slam final. And with Djokovic and Nadal being 1 and 2 at that point and the gap seemingly widening after that Aussie Open final, what came next I think is one of the most pleasant of surprises for Nadal fans and how this season panned out. Even making the final in Melbourne, he was having more injury issues and taking some bad losses. And then we get to Rome and he drops the iconic quote, "What happened in Monte Carlo happened, what happened in Barcelona happened, what happened in Madrid happened. Here we are in Rome." And as iconic and memed as that line became, it truly marked an inflection point in Nadal's 2019. He plays one of his most dominant tournaments on clay ever in Rome, dishing out bagels left and right. And once he displayed he still had that form, it felt like the usual. It was going to need a miracle for him not to win Roland Garros. Good final actually there with Domi. But after the infamous "we are in Rome," Nadal would proceed to lose a grand total of 2 matches the rest of the season, one to Federer in the semis of Wimbledon, which he followed up with victories in Montreal and then a thrilling US Open final, stopping a red-hot Daniil Medvedev that summer by the skin of his teeth in the final. which, in conjunction with his metronomic consistency following Rome, it was enough to reclaim and finish the year the world number one, cap the year off with a splendid effort in Davis Cup near one-man show there. I can't give 2019 an S, but it is definitely one of the more enjoyable and years I'm most proud of. I think it's a strong entry in A tier. 2020 is a real simple one. Maybe he suffered from overplaying at the start of the year and a loaded schedule at the back end of 2019. But ultimately at the big one in Melbourne, he played pretty well. A couple points here or there, and it could have gone the other way, but Dominic Thiem just outplayed him in the most crucial moments. Not much to speak of after that, as soon after the tour shut down until August. Nadal, of course, opted out of traveling to the States, made his return on clay. Questions surrounding how he'd fare with the long break and the conditions with clay occurring at a different point in the calendar. He sort of cruised along until making a huge statement in the final with one of his signature performances of his career. Winning Roland Garros was really all that mattered, and he got that done. Therefore, I do think he made the best of what was a truncated calendar. He did maybe underperform because he had a really good look at winning the Tour Finals for the first time. But that annoying loss aside, I think he did his job, defended the land in Paris in very unique circumstances, mostly out of his control, that this season gets its place in B tier. I do think we got the hints of a slight Nadal slowdown post the tour resuming in 2020, and I think that continued to carry itself through 2021. Just some very natural physical regression in his age 35 season. It got off on the wrong foot with the back injury in Australia. Younger legs and Tsitsipas ended up winning. Probably wouldn't have mattered anyways with the draw ahead of him. And he opted to pack it in until clay to get back at 100%. Not your typical clay court season from Rafa Nadal. Vulnerable throughout. A couple match point saves away in Barcelona and Rome from going titleless all clay court season. But to be fair, we found ourselves in a very familiar position after Rome, where in what is likely to be his last Masters 1000 title, it was an underratedly impressive run, very difficult draw, and in the final it seemed like he had restored order as the favorite heading to Roland Garros. Obviously, Roland Garros built up to that epic semifinal between Nadal and Djokovic. Obviously, it ended in only the second time Nadal resembling what we've come to know of him at Roland Garros, coming out on the losing end. Mammoth effort from Djokovic, even physically compromised at the end. I doubt anybody else was beating Nadal that event. Ultimately, the foot pretty much decided that was it for Rafa's 2021. His game was never as poor as 15 and 16. But it was still a struggle pretty much all the way through, even when he was able to take the court. 2021 goes in C tier. 2022, as it turned out, became Nadal's last word in the slam race, in what is likely to be Rafael Nadal's last act as the Nadal we knew. 2022 up through Wimbledon served to add the last couple cornerstones in Rafael Nadal's legacy. A long-awaited second Australian Open title came when we least expected it, and as I often say, 2022 Nadal served as sort of a fountain of youth moment for him, both mentally and physically. Post-prime Nadal had been prone to mental lapses unlike we'd seen in his prime, but 2022 Rafa was certainly the exception to that rule. Undefeated in 4 5-setters, unusually phenomenal in tiebreakers through the winning run, added on to some crazy endurance feats. Obviously, he won the Australian Open almost exclusively on guile and grit, completing another crazy successful injury comeback after a long layoff, culminating in his greatest ever comeback, the second longest match he's ever played at 35 years of age, the Miracle in Melbourne. This, of course, springboarded him into a 20-0 start to the year, lasted all the way through the Indian Wells final, where in doing so, he suffered a stress fracture in the ribs, and the first initial cracks with the body started to show. This derailed his clay court season. It seemed like he rushed back prematurely, And then to boot, he had his foot injury flare up again in Rome. Still, there was one more chapter to be written, and it seemed like he had accepted that even if this decision would bring his body to the point of no return, he decided playing Roland Garros with his foot anesthetized was going to be a risk he'd be willing to take. A couple more signature moments followed, winning just the third time he'd been pushed 5 sets at Roland Garros, followed up with an epic and dramatic win over Novak Djokovic in the quarterfinals in potentially their last ever match, before surviving brutal conditions against Zverev and then romping Casper Ruud for the 22nd major title. With this being the first time in his career he had won the first 2 majors of the year, Nadal looked poised to make his first push at a calendar Grand Slam, which makes it crazy how quickly it all fell apart for him. It seems one more blow to the body with the ab tear at Wimbledon has been the straw that broke the camel's back. On the other side of this ab injury, the rest of his 2022 pretty mediocre, but really just off of those first 6-7 months, I think this is a very easy A tier. And that pretty much brings us to where we are today, what we can take from 2023 and beyond. It's a sign of the old adage, Father Time is undefeated. Unfortunately, it cannot escape the D tier, but nonetheless, what a glorious journey it has been for the great Rafael Nadal. We end up with a tier list here that I think is very comprehensive and one that I am happy with. These guys' careers have unfolded like movies, so always a lot of fun to go back in time. But I would love to hear your thoughts, how you feel about my list, if you have any changes. Feel free to leave them in the comment section below. But that will do it for this video. I am looking forward to seeing Rafael Nadal back out on the court. I'm very grateful that he's been able to take the court this season. Maybe my glorious king surprises us. Hopefully there is another chapter left to be written. But regardless, as the kids say, I think the adage is, I will be there no matter what. Take care, you guys. I will see y'all in the next one.